it's great to have members of the broader community join us, and I would encourage you not to be intimidated by all the experts in the room, but especially during question period after, we want to hear from you, so please share your insights and ask questions when it's time. So I'm going to start off by passing it off to all the members who are sitting up here beside me, who are going to do a little recap to share with you some of the insights that they took away from this morning. So to start, I'm going to pass it off to my left, Laura Anthony, who's the research manager at Samara Canada.
Thanks, Caro. Hi, everyone. I'm briefly going to talk today about one of the key findings I thought from this morning in terms of public education and bringing Canadians together across the country to discuss electoral reform. So Samara Canada, for those of you that don't know, we're a non-partisan charitable organization that seeks to re-engage Canadians in the political process. So educating the public and giving them accessible materials about Canadian democracy and politics is kind of integral to what we do. So I think that content and accessible content about electoral reform changes and different electoral systems is really important to have as a part of this conversation. And we know that there's a lot of academic work to this effect, and there's some comparative international work, but really making it digestible for the public is really important. The second thing is time. So it's going to take a fair bit of time to engage the public and mobilize them in this conversation. And right now we've been given the summer, I think, is the set out time for consultation processes. But to do the work that we do with community organizations takes a bit more time than that to engage them with the conversation and familiarize them with the systems and the concepts. The other thing that I think is needed in a successful campaign is money. So it costs money to do this work. And as a charitable organization and as other community organizations will know, it's really crucial to have funding behind these kind of campaigns. And I think what we're seeing right now, there's kind of a polarized public. There's a number of Canadians that are really engaged with electoral reform and really aware. And then there's a significant proportion that aren't engaged at all. And I wonder what we could do to kind of bridge that gap, whether it's asking the really engaged Canadians to bring their family and friends that aren't engaged in the process along with the conversation, which is how other mobilization techniques work. It could be useful. So thank you.
Let me briefly introduce then the remaining speakers. To my left here, Mark Warren, who teaches in the Department of Political Science. He's the Merrilees Chair in the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions and an expert on democratic theory. So he'll speak to what we can learn from today's deliberations in relation to democratic theory. Next will be Richard Johnston. Matthew Shugart is going to go next. Very good. Matthew Shugart teaches at UC Davis and is a world-renowned expert on electoral systems and many other topics, including horticulture. Richard Johnston, who teaches in the Department of Political Science at UBC, also distinguished student of elections and voting and electoral systems. And finally, Kelly Carmichael, who is with Fair Vote Canada and has been working on this issue and has a number of very interesting proposals to present. We'll begin with Mark Warren for just 2 or 3 minutes recap of our discussion.
Okay, well, thanks, Max. Thanks for putting on this wonderful event. Thank you to everyone for the contributions this morning. I want to talk just for a couple of minutes about the question of public demand for electoral reform. Electoral reform it's not in the top 3 or 5 or maybe even the top 10 issues that people care about in part because it's a somewhat complex topic. And so if we just ask Canadians whether they are happy with first past the post, on average, they're not that dissatisfied. If you ask Canadians what they would like to see, proportional representation, yeah, single transferable vote, okay, but not an overwhelming sense for needing a new electoral system. So public opinion is soft, and this could undercut the kind of sense of urgency of the mission that appeared to be the case a year or so ago. But if we back off and we ask a slightly more political theory-ish kind of question, what kinds of values do Canadians have? We know from the BC Citizens Assembly that the Canadians do have fairly well thought out values that they would like their representative democracy to achieve. They would like representation to be fair. They would like local representation. They would like choices in their ballots. They don't like excessive partisanship. They want their government to work. The problem here is to connect these values to the mechanics of an electoral system. Those are the dots that are difficult to connect, certainly in the minds of the public. This is important for obviously generating legitimacy for any kind of proposal. It will be fairly easy, I think, to kill the proposal, given the softness of public opinion, with, say, an excessively adversarial campaign around this topic. So I guess the question then goes to process. How can Ottawa, how can we connect the values that Canadians have and are quite firm to some opinion about electoral process, electoral reform? We've talked about really three different models this morning. One is the consultation model. That is, we're not quite sure yet what it's going to be looking like. We are worried that this will set up perhaps an excessively partisan and adversarial process, which will quite predictably turn Canadians off of the process and tarnish any proposal that would come out of it. We talked in very general terms about a civic education type of model, where Canadians learn about electoral systems. This is a very high threshold. It's very hard to do, given that the attentive public on most issues, most times, is about 10 to 15% of the population. We also talked about the model that was tried out in British Columbia and Ontario, the Citizens Assembly process. This process had the advantage of actually connecting the relationship between values and an electoral system, a single transferable vote, for most people who voted in the 2005 referendum on the topic. The downside is this is a fairly intense process. It takes some time and it takes funding. And that's pretty much where we left off our discussion. Over to you, Matt.
Okay, thank you. It's quite an honor, given my interest as an academic in electoral reform, to actually have a chance to address a forum like this on that topic. Some of the research that I've done is on comparative processes of electoral reform, and I have to say processes of electoral reform rather than actual electoral reforms, because within the set of sort of, shall we say, Westminster or Westminster descended parliamentary democracies, there's only one case that's actually gone to a change of the system in all the cases of recent decades, and that would be New Zealand. So elsewhere, as you know, in the provinces, in UK, really twice, Blair had a proposal, but he shelved it, never held the referendum, and of course the Cameron-Clegg conservative Lib Dem coalition government held a referendum in which the Conservatives actually argued against making the change, and it didn't happen. So the question is, how do you design a process? I mean, if there's an agreement, as I think there is among most of the experts, that some sort of reform, presumably some sort of proportional representation, would be a desirable outcome, how do you design a process that actually gets you there but is also perceived as legitimate? And the legitimacy aspect is really important. If it is perceived as simply a government implementing a platform commitment, that might be a way to polarize it and to keep it as a permanent in quotation marks, but a persisting partisan divide and you don't want your electoral system itself to be a matter of partisan division where some future government perhaps manages to claim that it has a mandate to go back or to go to something entirely different. So comparing the other countries or the provincial jurisdictions that have had some sort of process that actually led to a proposal for a reform, the Canadian one is a surprise because it doesn't have any obvious crisis that has produced it, such as clearly anomalous election results. In New Zealand, prior to it, they had 2 consecutive elections in which the party with the most votes actually was in second place in seats, and the other party had a majority and therefore had all the power. In some of the provinces, there were grossly lopsided election results where the opposition was basically wiped out. That hasn't happened recently at the federal level, and so it's a surprise. On the other hand, it's an opportunity, as the discussion paper that we were all, that the roundtable participants received pointed out, it's a civic moment. It's actually a very rare case that a party has come into power with an explicit statement that the election under which we were just elected will be the last one under the electoral system that just delivered us this big majority in Parliament. Of course, they didn't know when they made the commitment that they were going to win a majority, which might itself be a problem. So that gives us 2 surprises, right? The first surprise is that there's even a process. But the other surprise is that the party that made this commitment actually wound up with a majority. So I just want to circle back to this legitimacy point. Is 2019 really important? I don't have an answer to that question, but is it critical? The platform commitment says that there won't be another first past the post election. That gives very little time to do it, and a strong risk that it's done in a way that's perceived as illegitimate, as a partisan decision. So are there ways, and again, I don't have the answer to this, but just questions that should be thought about here. Are there ways in which the process could be far enough along that satisfies the platform commitment, and then you have an election where it is an issue in 2019. If the Liberals lose, well, the process probably ends. If they win, they have a further mandate to continue it. And then the last thing I'd want to say on the sort of legitimacy of the process one is it certainly doesn't follow then that a referendum is the best way to get it. I think in the days after the Brexit referendum, we have to be aware of referenda can produce really kind of objectively bad outcomes. Yes, I know there were people who really wanted this and a majority of voters did vote for it, but it's kind of a bad outcome in all sorts of objective ways, and referenda on something like an electoral system that many people simply don't understand, as you pointed out, is a recipe for failure, and we've seen that already. So I think I'll pass it on to Dick now.
So some of my thoughts reasonably directly reflect what I heard, but most of them are stimulated by it and go beyond it. But the question of the deadline is a starting point. The fact that the commitment was made, or at least the platform promise was made, that this would be the last first past the post, does create an opening. It creates a moment. Does it follow from that it really has to be the last fought under first past the post? I mean, the government, in its so far still brief life, has at least missed a number of deadlines and has been forgiven for it, because missing those deadlines actually seemed to be the right thing to do at the time to move the decision closer to a good and proper result. Now, missing it by a few weeks is one thing, missing it by an election may be another thing. But I think that if there's some credible case to be made that the government is prolonging the debate in order to get the answer right, then I think that from the point of view of advocates, it should be cut slack on that front. And so to a certain extent, I think and I heard this to a certain end of the room, that advocates themselves have to ask themselves whether pressing for anything definitive at this point is premature and risks undermining the whole project, whatever that project is for electoral reform. So that's my first point. My second point, it's related, is that the legitimacy question that Matt underscores, I think the fundamental point is that it is not appropriate, it would not be legitimate for a single-party majority government, particularly one with a relatively modest popular vote base, to impose an alternative electoral arrangement that, whether or not it really favors them as much as is commonly believed, has the appearance of favoring them. That, I think, is pretty clear, would be illegitimate. What then would be the alternative to that mechanism? Referendum comes up partly out of force of habit, because we've used it a number of times in this country, and also referendums figured in the New Zealand sequence as well. But if the critical thing is to get beyond a choice that is the private property of the party that happens to be the single party majority of the day, there actually are alternatives to referendums that are worth considering, though some of these alternatives may ultimately include a referendum. But, you know, there is, first of all, the possibility of a citizens' assembly, which might have to be linked to a referendum, but not necessarily. Citizens' assemblies are expensive, they take a long time, but I think the record of the BC Citizens' Assembly is quite a remarkable one. Doesn't have to be a citizens' assembly. You could imagine, for example, the sort of thing that the U.S. Congress uses under certain purposes when there are these extremely difficult questions for it, base closings being the classic example in the U.S., in which you put it out to a commission. The commission comes back with a fixed menu, and it's up or down on the menu. So you could imagine something like that, in which there is an extensive period of consideration that could involve a group of people who are authentically representative of the electorate at large, but not necessarily if it came back to a body that was representative in some form or another. So I think that the exact mechanism by which we get beyond choice by the single party that happens to be in power I don't think there's any actual single alternative. One could imagine combinations of alternatives, but what I think we need to do is unpack the kind of considerations that are embedded in any alternative that you would want to consider to a single party choice. There's a question of sort of who owns the result? Is there deliberation around the alternative? And most importantly, is that deliberation around the alternative detached from the immediate interests of the partisans and politicians of the day? Not that those interests are illegitimate, but ideally, at least from the point of view of the legitimacy of the framework, and one of the tests of the legitimacy of the framework is that it survives the next round of elections, right? That it sticks, that it's not merely a plaything of one party. That's a really critical thing. There's any number of ways in which you can get there, but it's difficult to imagine getting to any of them before 2019.
Hi there, it's my turn, I guess now. I'm Kelly Carmichael from Fair Vote Canada. Many of you may know a little bit about Fair Vote Canada, but we have support and outreach to citizens who want to change the electoral system to one that makes all votes equal and effective, which is a proportional representation system. And I must say I was very honored to be invited here today to sit down with some of the greatest political minds here around electoral reform, electoral systems today, and had a lot of takeaways. And there was, I don't know that we had consensus on a lot of issues. I think a robust discussion absolutely needs to happen. This question of legitimacy is an important one. I think the government has done a few things to say that they're listening to Canadians. When they launched their election platform, they said it would be the last election under first past the post, but they also said that they would make every vote count, which is a tagline from our campaign, and we felt very honored that the government was listening to what we had to say. I think recently when they changed the makeup of the committee to reflect the popular vote, I think that was a great initiative to show citizens that they were listening, that they care about having more than one party say what is going to happen here. And when you speak to legitimacy, I think that everybody is in agreement that we need some type of multi-partisan support. But you also need the support of Canadians. And what does that process look like? And I'll just go through a few points about our day today. We heard from Peter Russell, who explained to us that minority governments are not a disadvantage. You heard that public opinion might be soft at this point in time, but I can tell you if you had polled this issue, and there have been polls in the past around proportional representation, it polled around 70%. When during the last federal government under the Conservatives, I think citizens sort of felt that there was a crisis here in Canada, that they weren't being listened to. And so that's a really important factor. And I think that was the crisis that sort of got us to this moment, citizens pushing this forward. And now we have a government who has said, okay, well, we're willing to talk about this. There has to be broad public support. There has been some concern about the timeline, the committee being pushed back. We know that the Elections Canada has told us that we need at least 2 years. If we're going to move to a proportional system, we need 2 years for boundary reviews and the boundaries to be changed for a proportional system. So the timeline's very, very tight. You know, citizens have identified a few problems that they want fixed. In every first-past-the-post election, every winner-take-all election, and that includes the alternative vote, half of the electorate is unable to elect a representative that is aligned with their values. That is not true under proportional systems. That's a big problem that citizens want fixed. 52% of citizens were unable to, they are the losers. We divide our voters, Canadians, into winners and losers. I don't think it has to be that way. So other countries with proportional systems, 85% of OECD countries, over 90 countries around the world use PR to elect their representative, and most citizens have an effective vote, depending on thresholds that might be introduced. Another issue that came up was women, the representation of women. Canada does very poorly under first past the post. Where did Grace go? I think she said we were ranked 82nd, that might be, but I know that we have 26% women in our parliament. And that is typical of winner-take-all voting systems. Proportional representation often does better electing women. So, we are at this moment, and we believe there's a couple things that have to happen with the outreach to citizens. When this government said that this was going to be the last election under first past the post, I think it's incumbent upon the government to explain to citizens, to start the discussion and say what's wrong with first past the post and why are we here and why are they doing this. And once they do that, I think that will take the discussion that much further, so we don't have to backpedal and explain that. And then there's the issue of the timeline and how are we going to outreach to Canadians and talk to them about this issue, and it's an important conversation that needs to happen. And I think that the government should take some responsibility to this. And that doing this right could be, a great legacy for this government. I think it's a principled decision that we want to have. I think we can reach out to Canadians. We have a public broadcaster. There's all kinds of ways to do it. But I think it's possible, and I think we're at this moment. And pushing it off past 2019 will probably not get us the results that we want. We've seen these issues shelved many times before. If we have a referendum, that'll just kill it. And some people would like that, to use that tool to kill it. So I think we have to be very specific about how we ask for these reforms.
Thank you, Kelly. So we just heard a recap from this morning. If you're more of a visual thinker and you want to see a recap from this morning, Anna Lee has drawn the conversations behind us over there, so please go and take a look after.